Final Fantasy VII was developed by Square and released in 1997, January 31st in Square's native Japan, and on September 7th here in North America, with the European PAL version coming out about a month later on November the 17th. While it released in 1997, development of the title actually began in 1994 just as development wrapped up on, you guessed it, Final Fantasy VI. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi once again took a step back to a producer role, allowing others on the team to lead the charge on this installment. Probably the biggest name to come out of Final Fantasy VII's development was Yoshinori Katase, who was originally one of the directors of Final Fantasy VI. He went on to direct this title as well. Now this is where things get really interesting, because development of Final Fantasy VII actually started on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which made sense considering Square's relationship with Nintendo up until that point, having released the first 6 Final Fantasy titles as well as Chrono Trigger and a handful of other titles on their platforms. A full prototype was created for the SNES, but production stopped so that team could help wrap up development on Chrono Trigger. But once that was completed, development resumed in 1995 and shifted back to Final Fantasy VII in earnest. Now, there was a debate internally about whether to continue down the 2D route, which obviously proved successful for the company thus far, or take on the, at the time, revolution that was to become 3D video games. Now, the team obviously decided to go the 3D route, but once that was decided, they then needed the hardware to help make their dream a reality. Really, there were only 2 options that rose to the top: Nintendo's N64 or Sony's first foray into the hardware market with the PlayStation. Now, according to those on the team, their decision was primarily influenced by 2 factors: the tech demo based on Final Fantasy VI, created using the soft image 3D software, and ever-increasing cost of cartridge-based games. Tech demos were created for an N64 version which used the planned 64DD add-on as its backbone. That version was discarded after early testing when higher polygon counts on some of the character models caused the game's frame rate dip to unplayable levels. On top of that, the game would have had to use an estimated 30 64DD discs to properly run Final Fantasy VII. Faced with both the technical and financial limitations offered by Nintendo's console, Square ultimately decided to use the Sony PlayStation for this and all of their future products. Now, despite the overall increase in visual and audio fidelity, the gameplay really didn't change all that dramatically from Final Fantasy VI and even V. With the increased power offered by the PlayStation, it was decided that the battle screens would feature shifting and changing camera angles. Sakaguchi, in his role as producer, spent much of his time and energy on the battle system, and probably the biggest change he implemented was the introduction of the materia system that allowed such a greater degree of player flexibility compared to earlier entries. Tetsuya Nomura also contributed to the battle system by creating the limit break system, which was a different take on the desperation attacks from Final Fantasy VI. Now, Final Fantasy VII at the time was one of the most expensive video games ever produced, with a budget of around $40 million, which, adjusted for inflation today, would be right around $64 million. The development staff also ballooned up to about 150 people for the final game. And for comparison's sake, the average team at that time was around 20 to 25 people, so this also constituted one of the largest development teams for a project at that time. The game's art director was Yusuke Naora, who previously served as a designer for Final Fantasy VI, but because of the scale and scope of this title, and for the first time in the Final Fantasy franchise, he was granted an entire team to help with the game's visual design. Everything from the illustration to the modeling of the 3D characters, textures, creation of the environments, and more were under his direction. Naora later defined the style as, quote, dark and weird. The logo for the fictional Shinra Corporation, which included a kanji symbol, was drawn by Naora himself. Promotional artwork, as well as the title's logo, was created by longtime Final Fantasy artist Yoshitaka Amano. The Meteor's coloring was heavily influenced by the game's general color scheme of blues and greens. The blues are influenced by the game's environmental themes, while the greens are influenced by the color of the lifestream and of Midgar within the game itself. The other big name to come out of the development of Final Fantasy VII was Tetsuya Nomura. He impressed Sakaguchi so much with his hand-drawn and handwritten ideas, he was subsequently offered the role of main character designer. One thing that had to change from previous entries, though, was the chibi art style. It was no longer fitting considering the overall direction and tone that the game was headed in. So Nomura, along with Naora, adjusted each character to have more believable actions, more fitting within the game itself. Some of the changes to the designs were that Cloud was originally meant to have slicked back black hair, notably to save polygons and processing power. That original concept later became the basis for the character Zack Fair. Aside from the art, the graphics represented the biggest shift in its move from the Super NES to the PlayStation with the introduction of computer 3D graphics. The developers originally wrestled with the idea of using 2D sprites on top of 3D backgrounds, but opted to drop that idea completely in favor of polygonal character models. Within the team, however, sprites were the more popular idea, but polygons were chosen because they could express more emotion than their 2D sprite counterparts. This decision was influenced by being exposed to the 3D character models in Alone in the Dark. Sakaguchi opted for using super deformed character models in navigation and real-time event cinematics, while realistic character proportions would be used within the battle sequences themselves. To help with all of this, the team purchased Silicon Graphics Onyx supercomputers and accompanying software Image 3D, Power Animator, and N-World for an estimated $21 million. Final Fantasy VII, from fairly early on in its development, was going to be a quote real 3D game, according to developers. So there were detailed plans in place when active development of the game started. However, the move from cartridge to CD-ROM did pose a few problems. Because of the slower access speeds posed by the CD-ROM format, i.e. load times, certain tricks were used to conceal that issue, like certain character animations being implemented to keep the players from getting bored. When it was decided that there would be 3D environments on top of pre-rendered backgrounds, came the focus on a more realistic presentation. Environments shifted along with the camera angles, character models also changed depending on their place within the environment relative to the camera and other factors. This more cinematic approach was from the direct influence of Katase, who was a fan of the parallels possible between motion pictures and video games. Final Fantasy VII featured two types of cutscenes: real-time featuring polygonal models on the pre-rendered backgrounds, and FMV or full motion videos. The game's pre-rendered FMV cutscenes were produced by Visual Works. Some of the artists on that team had worked on various Star Wars projects, Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, and True Lies. The team wanted to create additional CGI content featuring Vincent and Yuffie in the game's ending. However, it would have increased the number of discs needed for the game, so the idea was ultimately scrapped. Perhaps even more iconic than the environments of Midgar, Cosmo Canyon, and the designs of Cloud and Sephiroth is the soundtrack. Arranged and composed by longtime Square composer Nobuo Uematsu, this soundtrack is absolutely legendary within the industry itself. He originally wanted to have this game use CD quality music, but when that resulted in the game loading slower, that idea was scrapped in favor of MIDI sounds produced with the console's internal sound sequencer. With the increase in sound channels for the game's sound, Uematsu approached the project like that more of a motion picture and composed pieces that reflected the moods of each of the scenes rather than making strong melodies to define the game. The first piece he composed was the opening theme that played as the game's opening credits rolled. The track was well received within the development staff, and it gave Uematsu, quote, a sense that this would be a very good project, end quote. Probably the most recognizable track from the soundtrack is One Winged Angel. Inspired by Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, he wanted to create a more classical track and then infuse rock and roll of the 1960s and 70s on top of that. To create that sound, he spent weeks creating separate unconnected parts and then arranged them together to create One Winged Angel, an approach that he'd never used before. And there you have it, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this first part of the Final Fantasy VII retrospective. And did you know that Sakaguchi's original idea for Final Fantasy VII was for it to be a detective story set in the real-world New York City? So part 2 will tackle not only that, but the plot, the characters, and what the game ultimately became. So give this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button so you know exactly when part 2 will drop. And until next time, you guys stay safe.